The first thing Theodora Keating did after the undertaker's wagon rolled away from the ranch was pick up a shovel, because grief had never once put food on a table or kept a roof from leaking. And she had learned that lesson the hard way at the age of 22, standing over freshly turned earth in the Wyoming Territory in the spring of 1878. Her uncle Silas had been the only family she had left in this world, and now he lay beneath a mound of red dirt on the hill behind the barn, next to her mother and father, who had succumbed to fever some 6 years before. She had not cried at the burial. She had stood there with her jaw set and her eyes dry, because Silas Keating had spent the last 2 years of his life telling her, in that gravelly voice of his, that she would never survive alone out here, and she was determined that the last thing she would ever do was prove him right. "You hear me, girl," he had rasped from his sickbed not 3 days before he passed, his hand trembling as he gripped her wrist. "This land will eat you alive. A woman alone cannot hold 4,000 acres against the wolves, against the rustlers, against the winter. You sell to Beauregard Finch and you go east, back to your mother's people. Promise me." She had not promised him. She had only smoothed the blanket over his chest and told him to rest. And 3 days later he was gone, and she was alone in a ranch house built by her grandfather's hands, with 300 head of cattle, a barn that needed mending, and a banknote coming due in October that Silas had never told her the full size of until it was too late to do anything but stare at the number in horror. She stood at the graveside long after the few mourners had gone, the wind pulling at the black dress she had borrowed from Mrs. Abernathy in town, and she said aloud, to no one but the hill and the sky, "I will not sell this land, Uncle Silas. I don't care what it costs me." The wind did not answer her, but somewhere down in the valley a hawk screamed, and Theodora took that as answer enough. The trouble started, as trouble so often does, with a man on a horse who had no business riding onto her land uninvited. It was near a week after the burial, and Theodora was out mending a fence line along the eastern pasture, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hands blistered from the wire, when she heard hooves approaching at a canter. She straightened, wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, and reached instinctively for the rifle she had taken to keeping slung across her saddle since the day she became a woman alone. The rider who came into view was not one she recognized, and that alone was cause enough for wariness in a territory where every neighbor for 20 miles knew every other neighbor's business. He was broad through the shoulders, dressed plain in a canvas coat gone soft with wear, his hat pulled low against the June sun, and he rode a bay gelding with an easy, unhurried seat that told her he had spent more of his life on horseback than off it. "This is Keating land," she called out, before he had come within 50 yards, her rifle not raised but not far from her hand either. "You're trespassing, mister." He reined up at a respectful distance, and when he lifted his hat she saw a face that was younger than she had expected, sun-browned and honest, with a jaw shadowed by a few days' growth of beard, and eyes the color of creek water in autumn. "Didn't mean to trespass, ma'am," he said, and his voice carried the low, careful courtesy of a man raised to mind his manners even in strange country. "Name's Aaron Townsend. I've been riding through since Cheyenne looking for work. Man in town, fellow at the mercantile, told me the Keating spread might be needing hands, on account of," he paused, seeming to catch himself, "on account of your loss. I'm sorry for that, ma'am." "Didn't mean to intrude on it." Theodora studied him a long moment. She had heard plenty of drifters come through with sweet words and empty promises, men who would work a week and steal the silver on the 8th day, and she had no cause to trust a stranger simply because he had a kind face and spoke softly. "I've got no money to pay a hand," she said, which was mostly true, "and I've got no use for charity if that's what you're offering." "Wasn't offering charity," Aaron said, and something in his tone made her look at him again, more carefully this time. "I've got a saddle, a good horse, and 2 strong arms, and I go where the work takes me. I'll work for a meal and a place in your barn to sleep, and if the ranch does well enough by autumn to pay a wage, then we can talk wages. If not, I'll have lost nothing but time, and I've got plenty of that to spare." It was a strange offer, and stranger still that she found herself considering it seriously instead of sending him on his way. But the truth was that Theodora Keating had counted her cattle the night before and come up short by a number that frightened her. And she had walked the fence line alone for 3 days running with her back aching and her hands raw. And pride was a fine thing to carry, but it would not mend 4 miles of wire before the summer storms came. "You know cattle?" she asked. "Grew up on a ranch in Texas," he said. "My father ran 3,000 head before the war took the land from us. I've punched cattle from the Rio Grande to the Powder River since I was 14 years old. And why aren't you punching cattle for wages somewhere else, instead of drifting through looking for charity work?" A shadow passed over his face then, quick as a cloud crossing the sun, and he looked away toward the mountains for a moment before he answered. "Had a falling out with my last outfit. Foreman wanted me to do something I wasn't willing to do, and I told him so, and he didn't take kindly to being told no by a hired hand. It's a long story, ma'am, and not a particularly interesting one." She did not press him further, though she filed the answer away to examine later, the way she filed away everything that seemed to not quite fit. There was something in the careful way he held himself, something guarded beneath the courtesy, that told her he was a man who had learned to keep his own counsel. "There's a bunk in the barn," she said finally. "It's not much. And I'll expect a full day's work for it, sunup to sundown, same as I give myself." "That's fair," Aaron said, and something like relief passed over his features, though he tried to hide it. "More than fair." "Aaron Townsend," she said, testing the name in her mouth as though weighing it. "All right, then. Welcome to the Keating Ranch. Try not to give me cause to regret this." He smiled then, the first real smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his whole face from merely handsome to something that made her stomach do a small, unfamiliar flip. "I'll do my best, Miss Keating." "Mrs." she corrected out of habit, then caught herself. "Number Miss, I've never married." She felt foolish for the stumble and turned back to the fence before he could see the color rising in her cheeks. "The wire's this way. You can start by learning how I like my corners set." They worked the rest of that day in near silence, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. She found herself watching the sure, economical way he moved, the way he handled the wire without wasting motion, the way he seemed to anticipate what she needed before she asked for it. And by sundown she had grudgingly admitted to herself that she had not made a mistake in letting him stay. That admission would prove, in the weeks that followed, to be both the truest and the most dangerous thing she had thought in a very long time. The Wyoming summer settled over the ranch like a slow fire, and with it came the endless work of keeping 4,000 acres alive against drought, disease, and the constant threat of men who saw a woman alone as an opportunity rather than a neighbor. Beauregard Finch was the first of these to make himself known in earnest. He owned the Circle F spread that bordered Keating land to the south, an operation nearly 10 times the size of hers, and he had wanted her uncle's water rights along Cottonwood Creek for the better part of a decade. Silas had held him off through stubbornness, and a shotgun kept within easy reach, but Silas was in the ground now, and Finch clearly believed that a young woman without a man to stand behind her would prove a softer target. He rode up to the house on a Sunday afternoon in July, dressed in a fine black coat despite the heat, his mustache waxed to sharp points, 2 of his hired men trailing behind him at a respectful distance. Theodora came out onto the porch to meet him, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, and Aaron, who had been mending a saddle in the yard, straightened slowly and moved to stand near the porch steps without being asked. "Miss Keating," Finch said, tipping his hat with exaggerated politeness, "I was mighty sorry to hear about your uncle. Fine man, Silas. We had our disagreements, but I respected him." "I'm sure he'd be touched to hear it," Theodora said dryly. "What brings you out this way, Mr. Finch?" "Business, my dear, business." He dismounted without being invited to, which told her everything she needed to know about how he intended this conversation to go. I've come to renew an offer I made your uncle more than once. The Circle F would like to purchase the Keating spread, water rights and all. I'm prepared to offer a fair price, more than fair, considering the circumstances a young woman alone finds herself in. The ranch isn't for sale, Theodora said, keeping her voice level though her heart hammered. Now, Miss Keating, be reasonable. Finch's smile did not waver, but something colder entered his eyes. A ranch this size takes a man's strength to hold. Come winter, when the wolves are at your herd and the snows got you snowed in for weeks at a time, you'll wish you'd taken my offer while it stood. I'd hate to see a fine piece of land like this fall into ruin, simply because there's no one capable of running it properly. I'm capable of running it, Theodora said, and she felt Aaron shift beside the porch steps, though he said nothing, letting her fight her own battle as she clearly wished to. And I'll thank you to remember, Mr. Finch, that this is Keating land and it will remain Keating land for as long as I draw breath. Finch's gaze slid to Aaron then, taking his measure with the cold calculation of a man assessing a potential obstacle. And who is this? Hired hand, I take it, or something more? He works for me, Theodora said before Aaron could speak. That's all the explanation you're owed. Of course, of course. Finch's smile returned, thin and unpleasant. Well, Miss Keating, the offer stands until the end of summer. After that, I fear circumstances may change, and not in your favor. This is hard country. Hard country has a way of humbling the proud. He remounted, tipped his hat once more, and rode off with his men trailing behind him like crows following a wounded animal. When he had gone, Theodora let out a breath she had not realized she was holding and found her hands were shaking. You did well, Aaron said quietly. Standing your ground like that. He'll be back, she said. Men like Finch don't take no for an answer easily. My uncle held him off for years, but Uncle Silas had a reputation, and a shotgun he wasn't afraid to use. She looked down at her own hands, still trembling. I don't know if I have what it takes to hold him off the same way. You held your ground just now, Aaron said. That's more than most would manage, facing down a man like that alone. I wasn't alone, she said before she could stop herself, and then flushed at what the words implied and busied herself with straightening her apron so she would not have to meet his eyes. I mean to say you were here, that's all. I was here, Aaron agreed, and there was something warm in his voice that made her chest ache in a way she did not have a name for yet. And I intend to keep being here, Miss Keating, for as long as you'll have me. She looked up at him then, really looked, and saw in his face something that frightened her more than Beauregard Finch ever could, because Finch threatened only her land, while Aaron Townsend, with his careful courtesy and his Creekwater eyes, threatened something far more vulnerable. The walls she had built around her heart since her parents died and left her to be raised by a hard uncle who believed sentiment was a luxury the frontier could not afford. Come inside, she said instead of answering. Supper won't cook itself, and you've earned a meal after the day's work. But that night, lying awake in the bedroom that had been her parents' and then her uncle's and was now, at last, entirely her own, she found herself thinking not of Beauregard Finch's threats, but of the way Aaron Townsend had stood beside her porch steps, ready to defend her without needing to be asked, and she did not know what to make of the warmth that thought stirred in her chest. Summer deepened, and with it grew a quiet, careful understanding between Theodora and Aaron that neither of them spoke aloud but both of them felt, in the way he handed her down from the wagon after trips into town, in the way she began setting a place for him at the kitchen table rather than sending his meals out to the barn, in the small kindnesses that accumulate between two people who are falling in love without quite admitting it to themselves. It was in early August that Theodora finally asked him the question that had been sitting on her tongue for weeks. They were sitting on the porch after supper, watching the sun bleed orange and purple across the western hills, and she had brought out 2 cups of coffee, handing him one before settling into the chair beside his rather than across from him, a small change in habit that she was not sure he noticed but that felt significant to her. Tell me about the outfit you left, she said. The real story, not the short version you gave me that first day. Aaron was quiet for a long moment, turning his cup in his hands, and she thought perhaps he would refuse to answer or offer another polite deflection. But finally he spoke, his voice low and careful. "I was riding for the Bar M, up near the Powder River country. Foreman was a man named Dutch Ambrose, hard man, harder than most, and he had it in his head that the Cheyenne families camped along the river that summer were poaching our cattle. There wasn't proof of it, not real proof, just missing head that could as easily have wandered off or been taken by wolves. But Dutch wanted to ride down on their camp and make an example, teach them a lesson, he said, and he wanted every hand on the ranch to ride with him." Theodora sat very still, watching his face in the fading light. "I told him no," Aaron continued. "Told him there wasn't proof enough to justify riding down on families, women and children among them, over cattle that might have simply wandered off. He called me an Indian lover, said I didn't understand what it took to protect a man's property in this country. I said I understood plenty, and what I understood was that I wasn't going to ride against people who'd done nothing but try to survive the same hard winter we all survived. He fired me on the spot, told me I'd never work another outfit in the territory once word got around." "Did the raid happen?" Theodora asked quietly. "It happened," Aaron said, and his jaw tightened. "I heard about it later in town. 3 men dead, none of them proven guilty of anything but living where Dutch Ambrose didn't want them living. I've carried that with me since, the knowledge that I rode away instead of finding some way to stop it. I don't know if there was anything I could have done, 1 man against a dozen riders who'd already made up their minds, but I've wondered." "You couldn't have stopped a dozen armed men alone," Theodora said gently. "Refusing to ride with them, that was the right thing to do, even if it wasn't everything. Maybe." He looked out at the darkening hills. "I've been drifting since, looking for an outfit that wants a hand more than it wants a follower who won't ask questions. Your uncle's ranch, when I heard about it in town, heard about a woman running it alone after her uncle passed, I thought perhaps here was a place where a man could do honest work without being asked to do dishonest things." "You found that place," Theodora said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I don't hold with cruelty, Aaron, not to man or beast, and I never will. Whatever else this ranch becomes, it won't become a place where a man's asked to do wrong in the name of profit." He looked at her then, and something passed between them in the gathering dark, something unspoken but deeply felt, and she thought for one breathless moment that he might reach for her hand, and she found she wanted him to. But the moment passed, as such moments often do when 2 careful, guarded hearts are not yet ready to leap, and Aaron simply said, "Thank you for telling me that, Miss Keating. It means more than you know." "Theodora," she said softly. "You may as well call me Theodora, if we're to go on sharing porches and coffee of an evening." "Theodora," he repeated, and the sound of her name in his low voice sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the coffee in her hands. "Then you'd best call me Aaron, and we'll dispense with the formality altogether." "Aaron," she agreed and smiled, and the stars came out above them one by one while the coffee went cold, forgotten in their hands. The trouble with Beauregard Finch did not stay quiet for long, and by the middle of August it had escalated from veiled threats to something far more dangerous. Theodora woke one morning to find Aaron already up and out at the barn before dawn, which was not unusual in itself, but the tone of his voice when he called for her to come quickly told her something was badly wrong. She found him standing at the edge of the north pasture, his face grim, looking down at the carcasses of 6 cattle, their throats cut, left to bleed out in the grass sometime during the night. "Rustlers wouldn't do this," Aaron said quietly before she could ask. "Rustlers steal cattle, they don't slaughter them and leave them lying. This is a message." "From Finch," Theodora said, her voice tight with fury and something colder underneath the fury, something that felt uncomfortably like fear. "I can't prove it," Aaron said, "but I don't imagine it was anyone else. 6 head is nothing to a man running the size of herd Finch runs, but it's enough to hurt a small operation like this one, and enough to frighten a person into thinking twice about holding her ground." "It won't work," Theodora said, though her voice shook slightly as she said it. "I don't care how many cattle he kills. I'm not selling this land." "I believe you," Aaron said. "But Theodora, we need to think about how to protect what's left of the herd and how to protect you, if Finch is willing to escalate to this." They spent that day and the days following setting up a rotation of watches, Aaron taking the night hours while Theodora watched the herd through the day, both of them running on too little sleep and too much worry, but neither of them willing to leave the cattle unwatched. Theodora rode into town and filed a formal complaint with the territorial marshal, a tired man named Hobbs who listened sympathetically but explained, not unkindly, that without proof of who had done the killing, there was little he could do beyond noting the complaint in his ledger. "I know it's Finch," she told him, frustration bleeding into her voice. "Everyone in this territory knows it's Finch. He's wanted my water rights for years." "Knowing and proving are different animals, Miss Keating," Hobbs said. "I'll ride out and have a word with him, let him know the territory's watching. But without a witness or evidence tying him directly to the act, my hands are tied same as yours." It was small comfort, but it was what was available, and Theodora rode home that evening feeling the weight of the ranch pressing down on her shoulders more heavily than it had since the day she buried her uncle. She found Aaron in the barn, checking over the rifle he had taken to carrying with him during his night watches, and she stood in the doorway a long moment, watching him in the lantern light, before he noticed her presence. "Marshal say anything useful?" he asked. "Not much," she admitted, coming to sit on an overturned bucket near where he worked. "He'll speak to Finch for whatever good that will do. I don't imagine it will do much good at all." "No," Aaron agreed. "Men like Finch don't respond to words. They respond to force, or to the clear knowledge that pushing further will cost them more than they're willing to pay." "I don't have the resources to fight him with force," Theodora said, the exhaustion of the past days finally breaking through the careful composure she had maintained. "I have 300 head of cattle, most of them now, and a banknote coming due in October, and one hired hand, and I don't know how much longer I can hold on before he finds a way to break me entirely." "You have more than one hired hand," Aaron said quietly. "You have a man who intends to stand beside you for as long as you'll let him, Theodora, and not merely for the wages, when there are wages to be had." She looked up at him, and in the golden lantern light she saw something in his face that made her breath catch, something raw and unguarded that he had kept hidden beneath careful courtesy for the whole of the summer. "Aaron," she said softly, "why did you really stay? That first day, you could have ridden on to any number of other ranches. Why stay here, with a woman who couldn't promise you wages, fighting a battle that isn't yours to fight?" He set down the rifle carefully and crossed the small space between them, and knelt beside the bucket where she sat so that their eyes were level in the lantern light. "Because the first time I saw you, standing in that pasture with a rifle in your hand, telling a stranger he was trespassing on land you intended to defend with your own two hands if necessary, I thought I had never in my life seen anything so fine. And every day since, working beside you, watching you fight for this place with everything you have in you, I have fallen a little further, until I don't rightly know how to stop, and I'm not sure I want to." Theodora's heart hammered so loudly she was certain he must be able to hear it. "Aaron Townsend," she whispered, "are you telling me you love me?" "I am," he said simply without hesitation, though his hands trembled slightly where they rested on his knees. "I love you, Theodora Keating. I've loved you for weeks now, and I've held my tongue because I didn't want to burden you with it, not while you're fighting to hold your uncle's ranch together and facing down men like Beauregard Finch. But I find I can't hold it back any longer." She reached out then and took his face in her hands, feeling the roughness of his sun-browned skin beneath her palms, and she said, "I love you too, Aaron. I think I have since that first evening on the porch when you told me your story and I understood what kind of man you truly are. I've been afraid to say it, afraid that loving someone means losing them, the way I lost my parents, the way I lost my uncle. But I don't want to be afraid anymore." He closed the small distance between them then and kissed her, gently at first, questioning, and when she answered by pressing closer, one hand still cradling his jaw, the kiss deepened into something that held all the longing of a summer spent in careful, unspoken devotion. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, Aaron rested his forehead against hers and let out a shaky laugh. "I confess," he said, "I did not expect to fall in love with a rancher's niece who threatened to shoot me the first time we met." "I confess," Theodora replied, smiling despite the exhaustion and fear that had brought her to the barn in the first place. "I did not expect to fall in love with a drifter who couldn't tell me a straight story about why he was drifting." "We make a strange pair," Aaron said. "We make the right pair," Theodora corrected, and kissed him again. And for a moment at least, the threat of Beauregard Finch and the weight of the bank note and the loneliness of the past months all fell away, leaving only the two of them in the lantern-lit barn, hearts finally unguarded after a summer of careful walls. But love, however true, does not pay bank notes or stop a man like Beauregard Finch from pursuing what he wants, and the days that followed brought new trials that tested the young couple's resolve even as it deepened their bond. The bank note came due in the first week of October, and Theodora rode into town with a knot of dread in her stomach, Aaron beside her for support, though there was little he could do to change the numbers in the ledger book. The banker, a thin, nervous man named Prout, went over the figures with her carefully, and the news was not good. "The note is for $800, Miss Keating," Prout said, adjusting his spectacles. "Your uncle borrowed against the land 2 years ago to cover a bad winter's losses, and the interest has accrued since. I'm afraid the full amount is due by the end of this month, or the bank will have no choice but to foreclose on the property." $800, Theodora repeated, the number landing like a physical blow. She had perhaps $200 saved from the sale of cattle over the summer, not nearly enough to cover the debt. "I understand this is difficult news," Prout said, not unkindly. "I might add, Miss Keating, that Mr. Finch has expressed interest in purchasing the note from the bank, should you be unable to satisfy it yourself. He has offered to cover the full amount, in exchange for the bank transferring the debt, and thereby the land should you default to him directly." The implication was clear, and Theodora felt sick with the understanding of it. Finch had been patient, waiting for exactly this moment, knowing that the note would come due and that a woman alone might not be able to satisfy it, and now he intended to use the bank itself as the instrument of taking what he had wanted all along. "How long do I have?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "The end of the month," Prout said. 3 weeks from today." They rode home in near silence, the weight of the news settling heavily over both of them. It was Aaron who finally spoke, as they crested the rise that looked down over the Keating ranch spread out in the golden afternoon light. 3 weeks isn't much time," he said, "but it isn't nothing either. We could sell more of the herd, drive them to the railhead at Cheyenne ourselves rather than waiting for a buyer to come to us. The prices would be better than what we'd get selling locally, and it might make up the difference. 300 head is barely enough to sustain the ranch through winter as it is," Theodora said. "If I sell enough to cover $800, I won't have enough breeding stock left to rebuild the herd come spring. I'd be trading one kind of ruin for another." "Then we find another way," Aaron said firmly. "Theodora, I didn't stay on this ranch to watch you lose it to a man like Finch through nothing but the cruelty of timing and debt. We'll find a way." That evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp burning low and papers spread between them, they worked through every possibility they could think of. Selling part of the herd was one option, though as Theodora had said, it risked the ranch's future even as it saved the ranch's present. Aaron suggested they might petition the bank for an extension, though neither of them held much hope that Prout, under whatever pressure Finch had already brought to bear, would grant one. It was Theodora who finally thought of the answer, sitting back in her chair with sudden realization dawning on her face. "The gold," she said. "What gold?" Aaron asked, looking up from the papers. "My grandfather," Theodora said, excitement creeping into her voice for the first time in days. Before he built this ranch, he prospected for a few years down in the Black Hills, back before it was even legal for white men to be there in the 60s. He didn't strike it rich, not by any account, but he kept a small cache of gold dust and nuggets, enough to buy the initial stock for this ranch when he settled here. I remember my father telling me the story when I was a girl, that there was still some of that original gold left, hidden somewhere on the property, kept as an emergency reserve in case hard times ever came again. I never gave it much thought, assumed my uncle must have used it or that it was simply a family story with no truth behind it. But what if it's real, and what if it's still hidden somewhere on this land? Do you have any idea where he might have hidden it? Aaron asked, hope kindling in his own eyes now. None, Theodora admitted. But my father mentioned once that grandfather trusted the old root cellar more than any bank, back before there were banks to trust or distrust in this territory. It's possible, Aaron. It's a chance at least. They spent the following days searching every inch of the old root cellar beneath the house, a space that had not been thoroughly explored in years, filled with old preserves gone to dust and forgotten tools, and the general accumulated debris of 3 generations of Keating family life. It was tedious, dusty work, made more urgent by the ticking clock of the bank note, but Theodora found something almost joyful in it despite the pressure, working alongside Aaron in the lamplight, their hands brushing as they moved old crates and shelving, stealing kisses in quiet moments between searching. On the 4th day, Aaron's hand, running along the base of the cellar's stone foundation, found a section of wall that gave slightly under pressure, a loose stone that had been mortared in place but not with the same permanence as its neighbors. Theodora, he called, excitement in his voice. Come look at this. Working together, they pried the stone loose, and behind it, in a small hollow carved into the foundation itself, they found a rusted iron box, its hinges nearly seized with age. Theodora's hands shook as she lifted it free and set it on the dusty cellar floor, and it took both of them working together to force the latch open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with decades of storage, was a small fortune in raw gold, dust, and nuggets both, more than either of them had expected to find. Oh, Aaron, Theodora breathed, staring at the gleaming contents of the box. It's real, it's really real. How much do you think it's worth? Aaron asked, equally stunned. I don't know exactly, Theodora said, but it looks like more than enough to cover the note and perhaps enough left over to see us through the winter besides. They embraced then, right there in the dusty cellar, laughing with the sheer relief and joy of the discovery, and Aaron lifted her clean off her feet and spun her around until she was breathless with laughter, the weight of the past weeks momentarily forgotten in the warmth of shared triumph. We'll need to have it assessed and exchanged for currency, Aaron said, once they had both caught their breath. There's an assier's office in Cheyenne that should be able to handle it properly, though it will mean a trip of several days there and back. Then we'd best leave as soon as we can arrange it, Theodora said. The note's due in less than 3 weeks, and I won't rest easy until this gold is safely converted and the debt is paid. They made the journey to Cheyenne within the week, Theodora keeping the gold secured in a locked strongbox beneath the wagon seat, Aaron riding alongside with his rifle within easy reach, both of them wary of the possibility that word of their find might have somehow reached Finch's ears, though they had told no one of the discovery beyond themselves. The assier, a careful, precise man named Mr. Dubois, weighed and tested the gold with professional thoroughness, and when he finally named the sum it was worth, Theodora had to sit down on the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. $1,200, Miss Keating, Dubois said. Give or take, depending on the day's exchange rate. Your grandfather clearly had a fine eye for quality ore, even if he never struck a proper vein. It was more than enough to satisfy the bank note with a substantial sum left over, enough to see the ranch through the winter in comfort rather than the desperate scraping by Theodora had feared, and perhaps even enough to invest in expanding the herd come spring. They rode home from Cheyenne with the currency secured and Theodora's spirits higher than they had been in months, and that night camped along the trail beneath a sky blazing with more stars than either of them could count. Aaron built a small fire and they sat close together, sharing the warmth and the quiet joy of a crisis, for the moment at least averted. "I've been thinking," Aaron said, staring into the flames, "about what comes after this. After the note is paid, after the ranch is secure for the winter. I don't want to simply go on being your hired hand forever, Theodora, working for meals and a bunk in the barn, while my heart wants something far more permanent." Theodora's breath caught, and she turned to look at him fully in the firelight. "What are you saying, Aaron?" He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small object, and when he opened his hand, she saw a simple gold band, plainly made but polished to a soft shine, clearly fashioned by his own hands from some of the raw gold, worked in secret sometime during their journey or perhaps before it, she could not say. "I had this made from a piece of the gold before we exchanged the rest," he said, his voice slightly unsteady with nervousness despite his evident preparation. "I asked the Assier's assistant, who does some work in jewelry on the side, to shape it while Dubois was assessing the rest. I know it's sudden, Theodora, and I know we've only known each other since June, but I have never in my life been more certain of anything than I am of my love for you. Theodora Keating, will you marry me?" Theodora stared at the ring, then at his face, so earnest and hopeful in the firelight, and felt her heart swell with a fullness she had never before experienced in her 22 years of life. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Aaron Townsend, I will marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, and then kissed her deeply beneath the vast Wyoming sky. And Theodora thought that surely no woman had ever felt so complete, so certain of her place in the world, as she did in that moment, engaged to a man who had ridden onto her land as a stranger and become, in the span of a single summer, the truest thing in her life. They arrived home the next afternoon to find, waiting on the porch, an unwelcome sight that threatened to shatter the joy of the previous night entirely. Beauregard Finch himself, along with 3 of his hired men, sitting astride their horses in the yard as though they owned the place already. "Miss Keating," Finch called out as they approached, his voice carrying false pleasantry that did nothing to hide the menace beneath it. "I understand you've been traveling. I hope your business in Cheyenne went well." "What are you doing on my land, Finch?" Theodora demanded, dismounting swiftly, Aaron close beside her, his hand near his rifle though he made no overtly threatening move. "I came to discuss the note," Finch said, "seeing as it comes due within the fortnight, and I understand from my sources at the bank that Mr. Prout has had no word from you regarding payment. I've come to renew my offer one last time, out of what I hope you'll recognize as genuine neighborly concern. Sell me the ranch, water rights included, and I'll cover the note myself, and see that you leave this territory with more money in your pocket than you'd have had otherwise." "The note has already been paid," Theodora said, her voice cold and steady despite the tension coiling in her stomach. "In full. We came from Cheyenne, where I converted a family inheritance into currency sufficient to cover the debt. You'll find no leverage against me through the bank any longer, Mr. Finch." Finch's face, for just a moment, betrayed genuine surprise, quickly masked beneath his usual smooth composure. "Is that so? Well, I confess I hadn't anticipated that development. It seems you're more resourceful than I gave you credit for, Miss Keating." "You'll find I'm considerably more resourceful than you've credited me for on several counts," Theodora said, "including the fact that I have witnesses now, Mr. Finch, to your presence on my land uninvited, following weeks in which 6 of my cattle were slaughtered in what I have every reason to believe was an act of intimidation ordered by you. I intend to bring that evidence, along with today's visit to Marshal Hobbs, and I intend to see you held accountable for it, to whatever extent the law allows." "You have no proof of my involvement in any slaughtered cattle," Finch said, his voice hardening now that his initial approach had failed. Perhaps not proof enough for a court of law, Theodora said, but proof enough that every rancher in this territory will know what kind of man you are and what kind of tactics you're willing to use against a woman who refuses to be bullied off her own land. I imagine that reputation will cost you more, in the long run, than any water rights ever could have gained you. Finch's jaw tightened, and for a moment Theodora thought he might resort to open threat, but whatever calculation ran through his mind in that moment, he seemed to decide against it, perhaps recognizing that with Aaron standing armed beside her and the clear evidence of her resolve, further pressure would gain him nothing but further exposure. "You've made your point, Miss Keating," he said finally, gathering his reins. "I'll trouble you no further on the matter of the ranch. But I'd advise you to watch yourself all the same. This is hard country, and hard country has a way of finding those who think themselves beyond its reach." "That sounds remarkably like a threat, Mr. Finch," Aaron said, speaking for the first time, his voice low and dangerous in a way Theodora had not heard from him before. "I'd advise you to consider carefully before you make it plainly enough that I might feel obligated to respond to it directly." Something in Aaron's tone, or perhaps in the set of his shoulders, made Finch reconsider whatever further words he might have intended. He simply nodded once curtly and turned his horse, riding off with his men trailing behind him, and this time Theodora did not think he would return, at least not with the same confidence he had carried before. "Do you think that's the end of it?" she asked, once the riders had disappeared over the rise. "I think," Aaron said, drawing her into his arms, "that Beauregard Finch has just learned that Theodora Keating is not a woman to be trifled with, and that whatever schemes he might still harbor, he'll think twice before acting on them openly. As for what happens beyond that, we'll face it together, whatever comes." She rode into town the following day and reported the full account to Marshal Hobbs, who took her statement seriously this time, given the additional weight of Finch's visit and implied threats. Whether it was Hobbs's subsequent conversation with Finch, or simply the man's recognition that his schemes had failed to bear fruit, Beauregard Finch troubled the Keating ranch no further in the months that followed, and eventually, some years later, sold the Circle F spread entirely and left the territory, though that is a smaller footnote to a story that by then had already found its proper and happy shape. With the note paid and Finch's threat receding, Theodora and Aaron turned their attention to the wedding, and to the practical matters of building a life together on the ranch that had, through so much struggle, become truly and fully hers. They were married in October in the small church in town, with a gathering of neighbors and friends that surprised Theodora with its warmth, for she had not realized, in the isolation of grief and struggle that had followed her uncle's death, how much genuine goodwill the surrounding community held for her. Mrs. Abernathy, who had lent her the black dress for Silas's funeral, now helped her into a wedding dress of pale blue, sewn from fabric purchased in Cheyenne, with a portion of the gold that remained after the note was settled. The ceremony was simple, as was fitting for the frontier, conducted by a circuit preacher who visited the territory only twice a year, but happened, fortuitously, to be passing through at exactly the right time. Theodora wore her mother's cameo brooch, the one keepsake she had managed to preserve through all the years of loss, and Aaron wore a new coat purchased for the occasion, looking so handsome and so nervous in equal measure that Theodora had to bite back laughter even as tears of joy gathered in her eyes. "Do you, Aaron Townsend, take this woman, Theodora Keating, to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the preacher asked. "I do," Aaron said, his voice clear and certain despite the slight tremor of emotion beneath it. "With all my heart I do." "Do you, Theodora Keating, take this man, Aaron Townsend, to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Theodora said, and found her own voice thick with tears she made no effort to hide, because for the first time since her parents' death, she felt not merely surviving but truly, wholly happy, standing in a small church surrounded by people who had come to wish her well, marrying a man who had ridden onto her land as a stranger and left it, in the span of a single summer, as the truest love of her life. They were pronounced husband and wife to warm applause and a few tears from the assembled women. And when Aaron kissed her, gently and reverently in front of the whole congregation, Theodora thought that surely her uncle Silas, wherever his spirit now resided, must be watching. And she hoped, fiercely, that he could see how wrong he had been about her inability to survive alone, though she was glad, more glad than she could express, that she would not have to prove that survival in solitude after all. The years that followed were not without their hardships, for ranching in the Wyoming Territory in the final decades of the 19th century was never an easy life, but they were years of deep and abiding joy nonetheless, built on the foundation of partnership and love that Theodora and Aaron had forged together through that first difficult summer. They expanded the herd steadily, using the remaining gold to purchase quality breeding stock that improved the bloodlines of the Keating cattle year over year, until by the mid-1880s the ranch had grown to rival even the Circle F in its heyday, though under far more honest management than Beauregard Finch had ever practiced. Aaron proved as skilled at the business side of ranching as he was at the physical labor of it, and together they built a reputation throughout the territory as fair, honest ranchers who treated their hired hands well and their neighbors better, a reputation that Theodora took particular pride in, knowing it stood in direct contrast to the reputation Finch had cultivated through fear and intimidation. Their first child, a son, was born in the autumn of 1879, less than a year after their wedding, and they named him Silas, after the uncle whose gruff warnings had, in their own way, set the whole story in motion. Theodora liked to think that somewhere, wherever spirits go, her uncle appreciated the gesture, even if he might have grumbled about it in typical Silas fashion, insisting he wanted no such sentimental tribute even as his eyes in life would surely have shown how touched he truly was. Their second child arrived 2 years later, a daughter they named Margaret after Theodora's mother, and she grew up with her father's creekwater eyes and her mother's stubborn determination, a combination that made her, by all accounts, an absolute terror to any ranch hand foolish enough to underestimate her, much as strangers had once underestimated her mother. 3 more children followed over the subsequent decade, 2 more sons and another daughter, filling the ranch house with the noise and chaos and boundless love of a large frontier family. And Theodora often found herself, in quiet moments, standing on the porch where she had once faced down Beauregard Finch, watching her children run through the same pastures where she had once mended fence alone, and marveling at how completely her life had transformed from that lonely, grief-stricken spring when she had buried her uncle and vowed to prove him wrong. Aaron never did learn the full details of what had happened at the Bar M outfit after he left it, but years later, a letter arrived from a man who had once ridden with him there, informing him that Dutch Ambrose had eventually been brought before territorial authorities for a separate act of violence against a group of settlers, and had spent several years in the territorial prison as a result. It was not the justice Aaron had hoped for on behalf of the families harmed in that earlier raid, but it was something, at least, a small acknowledgement that cruelty eventually finds its reckoning, even if that reckoning comes slower and less complete than one might wish. Theodora, for her part, never forgot the lesson of that difficult first summer, and she made it a point, throughout her years running the ranch alongside Aaron, to treat every hired hand who came through their gates with the same fairness and respect that Aaron himself had shown her from that very first day. When young women in the surrounding territory found themselves in circumstances similar to her own, widowed or orphaned and left to manage property alone, Theodora made herself available as a source of counsel and support, sharing what she had learned about standing firm against men like Beauregard Finch, about the particular strength required of a woman determined to hold her own ground in a land that so often assumed she could not. "You'll never survive alone out here," her uncle had told her, and in the strictest sense perhaps he had been right, for she had not, in the end, survived alone. But Theodora came to understand, over the years of her marriage to Aaron Townsend, that surviving alone had never truly been the point. The point had been survival itself, in whatever form it took, and if that survival came through partnership rather than solitude, through love found unexpectedly on a hard cattle trail rather than isolation proudly maintained, then that was not a failure of her uncle's warning but simply a fuller, richer truth than his gruff frontier wisdom had accounted for. On the 20th anniversary of Keating's death, Theodora and Aaron walked together up the hill behind the barn, now grown considerably larger to accommodate the herd's expansion, to the small family cemetery where Silas rested alongside Theodora's parents. Their children, grown now or nearly so, had scattered somewhat, young Silas managing a portion of the ranch's northern range with his own new wife, Margaret married to a rancher's son from a neighboring spread, the younger children still at home, but growing quickly toward their own independence. "Do you think he'd be proud of what we built here?" Theodora asked, standing before her uncle's weathered headstone, the granite softened now by 2 decades of Wyoming weather. "I think," Aaron said, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as the autumn wind stirred the grass around them, "that your Uncle Silas would take one look at this ranch, at the herd we've built, and the children we've raised, and the life we've made together, and he'd grumble something about how he always knew you had it in you, even though everyone who ever heard him talk about your prospects knows that isn't remotely true." Theodora laughed, the sound carrying warm and genuine across the quiet hillside. "That does sound exactly like something he'd say." "He warned you that you'd never survive alone," Aaron said softly, turning her gently to face him, his creekwater eyes now touched with the faint lines of years lived fully and well. "He was wrong about the alone part, but perhaps not entirely wrong about the rest. You needed help to build all this, Theodora. We all do in the end. The strength was never in standing entirely apart from everyone else. The strength was in choosing who to stand beside and choosing well." "I chose well," Theodora said, reaching up to touch his weathered face, the same face that had appeared on horseback that first June day, a stranger asking for work who had become in the years since her whole heart and her truest home. "I chose you, Aaron Townsend, and I would choose you again every single time in every life I might live." "As would I choose you," Aaron said, "every time in every life." They stood together on that hillside a while longer, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in colors that reminded Theodora, as it always did, of that first evening when Aaron had told her the truth about why he'd left his old outfit, and she had understood, for the first time, what kind of man he truly was. Below them, the ranch spread out in prosperous, well-tended acres, cattle grazing peacefully in pastures that Theodora herself had once mended alone with blistered hands and a heart determined to survive, whatever the cost. She had survived in the end, exactly as she had vowed to that first day standing over her uncle's grave. But survival, she had learned in the 2 decades since, was never meant to be a solitary triumph, proved through isolation and stubborn pride alone. It was meant to be shared, built alongside a partner whose love strengthened rather than diminished her own resolve, whose presence beside her had transformed a lonely inheritance into a thriving legacy that would carry the Keating name, and now the Townsend name alongside it, forward into a new century that neither of them could yet fully imagine, but that both of them faced together, hand in hand, with hearts full of gratitude for the strange and difficult path that had brought them to this hillside, this life, this enduring, hard-won love. As the sun finally dipped below the mountains and the first stars began to emerge in the deepening sky, Aaron took Theodora's hand, and together they walked back down the hill toward the house where their children waited, toward the warm lamplight spilling from familiar windows, toward the life they had built together from nothing but grit, love, and the unshakable belief that even in the hardest country, even against the loneliest odds, 2 hearts determined to stand together could build something that would last for generations to come. And so they did, for many more years after, watching their children grow and marry and have children of their own, watching the ranch prosper through good years and hard ones alike, watching the wild frontier of their youth slowly give way to towns and railroads and the changing shape of a territory becoming, eventually, a state. Through all of it, Theodora Keating Townsend and Aaron Townsend remained exactly what they had become that first difficult summer: partners in every sense of the word, lovers whose devotion had only deepened with the passing years, and living proof that the harshest warnings, however well-intentioned, could not account for the transformative power of love found in the most unexpected of circumstances, on the hardest of ground, beneath the widest and most forgiving of frontier skies.